Hi.
They say trust is the foundation of any good relationship. For the longest time, I thought Clara and I had built something unshakable. Ours was a story that everyone envied, at least from the outside. She was the carefree, creative soul, and I was the steady, analytical type. Together, we felt like a balance of opposites. But foundations have cracks, and I was blind to how deep ours ran. It wasn't always this way. When I met Clara, I was in the middle of a tech conference I didn't even want to attend. She wasn't part of the event. She was at a nearby art gallery with some friends. We met at a coffee shop of all places and somehow struck up a conversation over the complexity of latte art. She teased me about being overly serious when I mentioned my job in cybersecurity, and I marveled at how effortlessly she talked about turning mundane moments into stories for her blog. She was magnetic, and I couldn't resist being pulled into her orbit. 3 years later, we were married. Clara's social media presence had grown into a legitimate career. Her followers adored her curated snapshots of our life, weekend getaways, dinner parties, and candid moments of us laughing together. Meanwhile, I worked long hours leading a cybersecurity team at a firm that thrived on solving problems before they became disasters. We were different in every way that mattered, but we complemented each other. Or so I thought. For a while, life was good. Clara was supportive of my career, and I admired her drive to build something of her own. But somewhere along the way, things shifted. First, I didn't notice. Clara was always busy, and so was I. It wasn't unusual for her to work late into the night, drafting content or brainstorming ideas for collaborations. I respected her independence. If she needed space to do her thing, I gave it to her without question. Then the changes started. Small, almost imperceptible things. She became more protective of her phone, flipping it face down during dinner and excusing herself for calls. Notifications that used to flash openly on her screen were suddenly hidden, and when I asked about it, she'd laugh and say, "Just work stuff. You wouldn't find it interesting." I shrugged it off. Clara's work was her own, and I trusted her implicitly. Or at least I wanted to, but the unease didn't go away. She began spending more nights out, claiming she was networking at industry events. It sounded reasonable enough. Her career relied on connections, and as her husband, I wanted to be supportive. Still, there were times when she came home late smelling of perfume that wasn't hers, her hair slightly disheveled. One Friday night stands out. She kissed me on the cheek before heading out, saying she had a dinner with some colleagues from a new collaboration project. She was wearing her favorite red dress, the one she saved for special occasions. I didn't think much of it until I walked into the closet later that night and saw that same red dress hanging neatly on its hanger. My first reaction was confusion. Maybe she had another dress that looked similar? No, it was definitely the same one. I checked the time. It was almost midnight, and she wasn't home yet. When she finally walked through the door, she was all smiles, talking about how productive the evening had been. I wanted to ask her about the dress, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I muttered something about being tired and went to bed. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind raced through every interaction we'd had over the past few months, searching for clues. Had she always been this guarded? Or had I just not been paying attention? In my line of work, I've learned to trust my instincts. When something feels off, it usually is. The same skills that made me good at my job, reading between the lines, identifying patterns, were now telling me that something in my marriage wasn't right. The following week, I started noticing more. Her text responses became shorter, more clipped. She'd smile at her phone, then quickly put it away when I walked into the room. Once, I heard her laughing on a call in the next room, but when I asked who it was, she said, "Just one of the girls from my group chat." I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. One evening, while she was in the shower, I spotted her phone on the counter. It was unlocked, a rare occurrence these days. My heart pounded as I picked it up, scrolling through her recent apps. There was nothing incriminating, just emails, a weather app, and Instagram. But there was also an unfamiliar icon, a private messaging app one didn't recognize. I clicked on it, only to find it required a separate password. My stomach churned as I placed the phone back where I'd found it. I crossed a line, and it left me feeling ashamed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on than Clara was letting on. Every instinct screamed at me to dig deeper, but I told myself I was being paranoid. This was Clara, my wife, the woman who once convinced me to dance in a public square because life's too short not to. I decided to let it go. For now. After all, I was just being overly analytical, right? But the gnawing suspicion wouldn't let me rest. Looking back, that was the moment I should have trusted my gut. Because what came next would shatter everything I thought I knew about my marriage and myself. The days after I saw Clara's phone in the shower were weighed down with an unbearable tension. Clara seemed oblivious to the whirlwind of thoughts in my mind, going about her routine with the same practiced ease as always. Her smiles, her casual conversations, and even her attempts at small talk felt rehearsed, like she was playing a role in a script she'd grown tired of. I tried to push the unease aside. Maybe I was overthinking it, allowing my natural paranoia from work to bleed into my personal life. But the thought of that unfamiliar messaging app, locked behind a second layer of security, gnawed at me. It wasn't an app someone downloaded on a whim. It was intentional. One evening, as we sat on the couch, Clara scrolled absently through her phone while I stared blankly at the TV. The moments we used to share, where we'd laugh about nothing or argue over which movie to watch, had become hollow. I couldn't help but wonder if she was even present in the same space anymore or if her mind was somewhere, or with someone else. The following morning, while she slept, I picked up her phone again. This time it was locked, but the passcode was familiar. I entered it and was met with the home screen. My stomach churned as I navigated to the messaging app, only to find a login page. It asked for credentials I didn't have. Disappointment coursed through me, but I wasn't ready to give up. Searching through her phone, I opened her notes app, hoping for a clue. What I found wasn't incriminating on its own. A simple list of dates and locations, but the entries felt strange. Each date was paired with a restaurant, a park, or a hotel. None of it seemed work-related, but it was neatly categorized in a way that felt deliberate. The following week was a blur of suspicion and guilt. I couldn't shake the feeling that Clara was hiding something, but I hated myself for even entertaining the idea. I had always been the rational one, the one who trusted her implicitly. Now, that trust felt like a fragile house of cards, ready to collapse. At work, my focus faltered. My mind drifted back to the dates and locations in her notes and the messaging app locked behind a barrier I couldn't breach. Every instinct I had, honed from years of analyzing systems for vulnerabilities, screamed that there was a pattern I hadn't yet uncovered. That Wednesday, while Clara went out for what she claimed was a collaboration shoot with friends, I decided to take a step I'd been avoiding. Using the skills that had earned me my position as a cybersecurity leader, I set up monitoring software on her devices. It was a line I never thought I'd cross, but the knot of doubt in my stomach had become unbearable. Almost immediately, the software flagged activity on her phone. Late at night, when I was asleep, she logged into the mysterious messaging app. Encrypted exchanges appeared, and while I couldn't decipher the contents, the frequency of the messages raised red flags. The breakthrough came that evening. As I monitored her phone in real time, I saw an unencrypted message come through. The sender was identified only as J, and the content was devastatingly simple. A message about meeting at the same place as before. Clara's reply, sent seconds later, confirmed the plan. Checking the GPS tracker I had discreetly installed on her car weeks earlier, I saw her heading toward an upscale boutique hotel. It was one of those places with sleek interiors and an air of exclusivity that catered to professionals looking for a touch of luxury. Sitting alone in my car outside the hotel, I watched the glowing sign above the entrance. Clara's car was parked nearby, her unmistakable vanity plate reflecting the streetlights. My chest tightened as I debated my next move. Confronting her here felt impulsive, but waiting any longer felt unbearable. Eventually, I stepped into the hotel lobby, trying to keep my expression neutral. The receptionist greeted me with a polite but questioning look, and I explained my presence, carefully constructing a plausible reason to access Clara's room. The explanation worked, and she handed me a keycard, pointing me toward room 418. The elevator ride to the fourth floor was excruciating. My heart pounded with every passing second, a mix of dread and determination coursing through me. When I reached the room, I hesitated at the door. My hand trembled as I slid the keycard and pushed it open. What I saw inside stopped me in my tracks. Clara was in bed, her hair disheveled, her body tangled with a man I didn't recognize. Their faces, frozen in shock, told me everything I needed to know. The air in the room felt suffocating as I stood there, taking in the scene. Clara scrambled for an explanation, her voice trembling as she tried to speak, but her words were drowned out by the roaring in my ears. The man beside her, just as panicked, stammered something about not knowing she was married, but it all felt like static. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The reality of what I was seeing sank in, shattering every illusion I had about our life together. The woman I had trusted, the woman I thought I knew, had betrayed me in the most intimate way possible. As I turned and walked out of the room, my mind raced. Every late-night phone call, every guarded text, every excuse about work, it all clicked into place. Clara's actions hadn't just broken my trust. They had upended everything I believed about us, about her, about myself. Back in the car, I sat in silence, gripping the steering wheel tightly. There was no going back from this. Whatever Clara and I had before was gone, replaced by a void I didn't know how to fill. I sat in the car, motionless. The hum of the engine filled the silence, but my mind was anything but quiet. A hurricane of thoughts tore through me, each one hitting harder than the last. How long had this been going on? Was this the first time, or had there been others before him? Every memory I had of Clara, her laughter, her touch, her promises, felt warped now, like a cruel joke I hadn't realized I was part of. It wasn't just anger I felt. Anger would have been easier, simpler. No, this was deeper, a hollow ache that reached into the very core of who I was. Clara hadn't just betrayed me. She dismantled the life we'd built together, brick by brick, while I stood there, blind to it all. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. Part of me wanted to drive away, to leave her and everything else behind. Another part, the rational, calculating side of me, knew I couldn't let this go without answers. Not yet. Back at home, the silence was oppressive. Clara wasn't there yet. She hadn't dared to follow me. That was fine by me. I needed time to think. I paced the living room, every step echoing in the emptiness of the space we once shared. My thoughts kept circling back to the same questions. Why? And how had I missed the signs for so long? The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was methodical. Clara had gone out of her way to hide her tracks, using encrypted messaging apps, vague excuses, and calculated deflections to keep me off the scent. It wasn't an impulsive fling. It was deliberate, planned. That realization cut even deeper. I sat down at my desk, the familiar glow of my monitor a small comfort in the chaos. If Clara thought she could outmaneuver me, she was wrong. My job revolved around uncovering hidden vulnerabilities, piecing together fragments of data to reveal the truth. This was no different. I began by going through the notes I'd taken earlier, the dates and locations from her phone, the GPS data from her car tracker, and the messages I'd intercepted. The pieces were all there. I just needed to connect them. First, I cross-referenced the dates in her notes with the GPS data. As expected, they aligned perfectly. Each entry led to a location Clara had visited under the guise of work or social events. Hotels mostly. Restaurants that didn't match the brand partnerships she claimed to be working on. Then there were the encrypted messages. While I couldn't access the contents directly, the metadata told its own story. The frequency of communication with Jay spiked on the days leading up to these meetings, then tapered off afterward. But there was something else, something I hadn't noticed before. A second set of messages, sent to another contact labeled only as M. The presence of a second person shattered any lingering hope that this might have been a one-off mistake. Clara wasn't just having an affair. She was juggling two lives, each carefully compartmentalized to avoid detection. M was a complete unknown. Unlike J, whose identity I'd partially uncovered, M left no digital breadcrumbs. No linked accounts, no shared locations. Whoever they were careful, almost as careful as Clara. That didn't sit right with me. People who go to such lengths to stay anonymous usually have something to hide. I couldn't concentrate at work that day. Every line of code I looked at blurred into an indecipherable mess. My mind kept spiraling, replaying every moment of the past few weeks, every clue I'd uncovered, and every lie Clara had told. The realization that this wasn't just about infidelity, that it went deeper, gnawed at me. Whoever M was, they had leverage over Clara and, by extension, over me. That night, I returned home determined to keep up the facade. Clara and I danced around each other like strangers, speaking only when necessary, avoiding eye contact. She didn't ask about my day, and I didn't volunteer anything. Beneath her calm exterior, I could sense the tension in her every movement. She knew I was closing in, even if she didn't know how much I'd uncovered. I spent the evening in my office, poring over the data again. The connection between Clara and M was undeniable. He was a high-profile figure in her industry, a brand executive with a reputation for ruthless ambition. From the metadata of her encrypted messages, I pieced together a pattern. Clara had been meeting him regularly under the guise of work. Their communication wasn't just about business, though. There were personal undertones, moments of intimacy woven into their exchanges. But there was more. M wasn't just a shadowy figure in her professional life. He was actively influencing it. Some of the brand deals Clara had landed, the collaborations she touted as her own achievements, were directly tied to him. He was pulling strings for her, opening doors she couldn't have accessed alone. And in return, the answer was painfully obvious. As the hours ticked by, I became increasingly fixated on a single question. Why? Why had Clara let it get this far? Was it greed? A desire for success at any cost? Or was there something more? Something I hadn't yet uncovered? I decided to take the investigation a step further. Accessing M's digital footprint was risky, even for someone with my skills. He wasn't just a random name. He was a prominent figure with a carefully curated public image. If I made one wrong move, it could draw attention I wasn't prepared to deal with. Still, I couldn't stop myself. I dug into his emails, his social media accounts, his professional network. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that M wasn't just manipulating Clara. He was using her. His connections extended far beyond the realm of social media marketing. There were ties to other influencers, whispers of scandals swept under the rug, and financial dealings that didn't add up. The next piece of the puzzle fell into place when I stumbled upon a series of payments from M to Clara. The amounts were significant, far more than what she earned from her regular collaborations. They were carefully hidden, funneled through intermediaries to avoid detection, but the trail was there if you knew where to look. It wasn't just an affair. Clara was complicit in something bigger, something darker. The next morning, I confronted Clara, or rather, I let her confront herself. I didn't ask her directly about M or the money. Instead, I let her squirm under the weight of her own guilt. I left my laptop open on the kitchen table, the screen displaying the payment records I'd uncovered. Clara froze when she saw it, her face drained of color, her usual composure cracking. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at the screen like it might disappear if she looked hard enough. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She tried to explain, to justify her actions, but her words felt hollow. She talked about pressure, about how competitive her industry was, about how she'd felt like she was drowning. M had offered her a lifeline, she said, a way to stay afloat, to keep her career alive. But I didn't buy it. This wasn't about survival, it was about ambition. Clara hadn't just made a mistake. She'd made a choice. Her confession, if you could call it that, only scratched the surface. She admitted to the payments, to the meetings with M, but she denied any deeper involvement. It was all business, she insisted, even as the evidence said otherwise. I pressed her on the encrypted messages, the hotels, the lies. She avoided my gaze, her silence speaking volumes. It was only when I mentioned the second man, Jay, that her facade truly crumbled. She tried to deny it at first, but the truth was written all over her face. Jay wasn't just a second lover. He was someone Clara had used to cover her tracks, to distract from the real connection with M. The depth of her deceit left me reeling. Clara wasn't just a liar. She was a manipulator, someone who had built her success on a foundation of betrayal, and I had been complicit, unknowingly supporting her every step of the way. For the next few days, I kept my distance. Clara stayed in the house, but we barely spoke. I needed time to think, to decide what to do next. Part of me wanted to confront M directly, to expose him and Clara for what they'd done. But another part of me knew that wouldn't solve anything. Instead, I focused on gathering more evidence. If this was going to end, I wanted it to end on my terms. I dug deeper into M's dealings, uncovering a network of influencers he'd exploited in much the same way as Clara. Some of them were complicit, others unwitting pawns in his schemes. It wasn't just about me anymore. This was bigger than my marriage, bigger than Clara's betrayal. On the 5th day, I made my move. I compiled everything I'd uncovered into a single file. The payments, the encrypted messages, the connections to M. Then, I sent it anonymously to several journalists I knew would take the story seriously. Clara found out later that evening. She confronted me, her anger spilling over as she accused me of ruining her life. But I didn't care anymore. Whatever we'd had before was gone, destroyed by her lies and choices. As she packed her things and left, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. This wasn't how I'd imagined our story ending, but it was the only ending that made sense. The fallout from the exposé was swift. M's network crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny, and Clara's career went with it. She tried to rebuild, to salvage what she could, but the damage was done. For me, the end of our marriage marked a new beginning. It wasn't easy. I had to rebuild my life from the ground up, but I found strength in the truth. In the end, Clara's betrayal taught me something I hadn't expected. That sometimes, the only way to move forward is to let go. In the aftermath of Clara's departure, the house felt unnervingly quiet. Her things were gone, her wardrobe emptied, her knickknacks removed from the shelves, but her presence lingered in subtle ways. A faint trace of her perfume in the hallway, an old photo I'd overlooked on the coffee table, and the silence where her voice once filled the space. It was strange how loss made you notice things you'd taken for granted, even when the loss was born out of betrayal. I didn't miss her. Not the Clara I'd come to know in those final days, at least. What I missed was the version of her I thought I'd married. The woman who'd once danced with me in the kitchen, who laughed at my terrible jokes, who seemed to see me for who I was and love me anyway. But that woman didn't exist. Maybe she never had. The fallout from my anonymous exposé unfolded like a slow-motion avalanche. M became the center of a growing scandal, his carefully curated reputation shredded under the weight of evidence. Financial fraud, unethical dealings, and personal misconduct all came to light. His ties to Clara were a minor footnote in a much larger narrative. But her career didn't escape unscathed. Clara tried to spin the story, painting herself as a victim of manipulation. But the public wasn't kind, especially in an industry where image was everything. Brands severed ties, followers dropped by the thousands, and invitations to events dried up overnight. She'd built her career on the illusion of authenticity, and once that illusion shattered, there was nothing left to hold on to. I didn't feel triumphant. Exposing her and M wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming some semblance of truth in a world that had become unrecognizable. Still, I couldn't deny the sense of closure it brought. In the weeks that followed, I started to rebuild. The first step was facing the emptiness I'd been avoiding, emotionally and physically. I cleaned out the house, removing the remnants of a life that no longer existed. Old photos, gifts, even the small mementos I'd once treasured. All of it went into boxes that I left on the curb for donation. Work became my refuge. There was something therapeutic about diving into complex problems, about losing myself in lines of code and algorithms that made sense in a way people rarely did. My team noticed the change in me. They didn't ask questions, but their support was evident in the way they rallied around me, taking on extra tasks when I needed space. I also reconnected with friends I'd drifted away from during my marriage. At first, it was awkward, admitting how much I'd let Clara isolate me in her world. But their warmth and acceptance reminded me that I wasn't as alone as I'd felt. One night, I received an email from Clara. It was short, almost clinical in its tone. She said she was sorry, not for what she'd done, but for how it had ended. She claimed she'd never intended to hurt me, that she'd been lost and made mistakes she couldn't undo. I stared at the screen for a long time before closing the email without responding. Her apology felt hollow, a bandage on a wound she'd never fully acknowledged. I didn't need her words to heal. I needed to let go of the part of me that still sought answers from someone who had none to give. Months later, my life had found a new rhythm. The house no longer felt haunted by Clara's memory, and I'd begun to rediscover pieces of myself I'd forgotten existed. I took up photography, something I'd always been interested in but never pursued. There was something liberating about capturing moments, about framing the world through a lens and finding beauty in the details. I also started attending therapy. It wasn't easy, confronting the anger, sadness, and guilt that had built up over years. But it helped me understand that Clara's betrayal wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was her choice, her failure, not mine. The final piece of closure came unexpectedly. I received a call from a journalist I'd shared the evidence with months earlier. The story about M had led to further investigations, uncovering a broader network of corruption that extended far beyond Clara's involvement. The journalist thanked me for my courage, though I wasn't sure I deserved the praise. After the call, I sat in my office, staring at the framed photo on my desk, a picture of me and my team celebrating a major project launch. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of pride, not just in my work but in the person I was becoming. Life moved on as it always does. The pain of Clara's betrayal didn't disappear, but it dulled over time, becoming a scar instead of an open wound. I found new connections, new passions, and, most importantly, a new understanding of myself. Clara had once been the center of my world, but in losing her, I found something far more valuable: freedom. Freedom to rebuild, to grow, to embrace a future that wasn't defined by her choices. And for the first time in years, I felt whole.
How was the video? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos. Leave your thoughts in the comment below. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.